Today we're going to have a quick chat about memory. We're going to look at how memory is defined, how it works, and then look at a few conceptual models that help us represent memory. What is memory? Memory is a cognitive process that allows us to store and retrieve information. It plays a crucial and often underappreciated role in our lives. It helps us with nearly everything we can think of, from memorizing phone numbers to saving lives. Think about a pilot taking corrective action for engine failure, or a paramedic treating a person injured in an accident. These tasks need us to recall complex details and procedures. Today, we're going to pull back the curtains just a little bit. How does memory work? On a biological level, parts of the brain, like the hippocampus, are involved, but we're going to look at this from a cognitive science perspective. In the digital age, we look at memory processes through the lens of a computer processing framework. As such, memory involves three core functions: encoding, storage, and retrieval. Let's demonstrate this with an example. Let's take Einstein's famous equation, E equals mc squared. When we want to store this information in memory, we first need to encode it or convert it into a meaningful format. We often do this consciously, like summarizing paragraphs, but it can also happen subconsciously. We then need to store this in memory, and we usually do this by associating it to things we know. As illustrated, we may be grouping it by subject, but we could also categorize it as famous equations by Einstein. Finally, for us to say that our memory is functioning correctly, we must be able to retrieve the information when needed. This can be during an exam or on a flashcard prompt. However, note that retrieval depends on a variety of factors. This includes similarity to the environment at the time of encoding, as well as stress levels. It is also important to note that memory is not a one-to-one recording of events as they happened. Instead, it involves a fair amount of reconstruction, as Frederick Bartlett showed in the late 1960s. Think of it like Lego bricks, where you have the whole set, and your job is to reconstruct what you saw in the original image. This has broad implications for fields like eyewitness testimony, which we'll probably cover in a later video. Most of us already have an idea about short-term and long-term memory. However, today we're going to take a look at conceptual models developed in cognitive research. Two giants in the field, Ebbinghaus and Bartlett, laid the foundations, but we're going to skip past that and directly move on to the multi-store model. This was developed in the 1960s by Richard Atkinson and Richard Schriffen. The sensory store is a very short-term memory store that captures input from our senses. It lasts for mere seconds. It acts as temporary storage for us to decide what we want to focus on. Short-term memory is one of the more well-researched components of the model. This is the part of memory activated by paying attention to something. For example, when we want to memorize a phone number, it is very apparent that it has a limited capacity. Finally, long-term memory is where information is stored, primarily in terms of its meaning. It seems to have a near infinite capacity, but not all information is always accessible. For information to be stored in long-term memory, we must first pay attention to it so that it is transferred to the short-term memory store. Then, when we rehearse something in short-term memory, it is transferred to the long-term memory. Later on, when we need that information, we can retrieve it from long-term memory into our short-term memory. One criticism of this model was that it did not recognize the short-term memory stores for auditory and visual information separately. This was later rectified in the working memory model proposed by Alan Baddeley and Graham Hitch in 1974. We can think of this as a refinement to the short-term memory store presented in the memory store model. It has three distinct components: the central executive, the phonological loop, and the visual spatial sketchpad. The phonological loop consists of two different subcomponents, the articulatory process and the phonological store. The store serves as a temporary store of auditory information, similar to the sensory store in many respects, while the articulatory process allows us to retrieve information from the store. It was found that visual memory was distinct from the phonological loop, since experiments that overloaded the phonological loop did not have any effect on recalling visual information. This component was formalized into the visual spatial sketchpad. It helps us with manipulating visual information. Finally, we have the central executive. This is a master system that coordinates the two systems to perform memory tasks. It also takes care of attention and directs focus in the memory context. Baddeley later proposed a new component called the episodic buffer in 2000, but that remains outside the scope of our discussion for now. To summarize, we've looked at the key processes that belie a well-functioning memory. We've also looked at some of the early memory models in an attempt to better understand how memory works. This is still a very small fraction of the overall research, and we'll continue to dive deeper into it in future videos. That said, I hope this was informative, and I also hope that you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.